In the dim, dusty archives of a wine estate on the outskirts of the city, a secret older than the vintage of the bottles it guarded waited to be uncovered. Someone had turned a celebration into a calamity, leaving behind a bitter elixir, not just of wine, but of revenge. Nero Wolfe, reclined in his orchid-scented brownstone office, raised a skeptical eyebrow as Archie Goodwin's call crackled in. "A poison vintage, Wolfe. And someone wants you to sniff it out before it ruins more than reputations." By the time the cab doors slammed behind them, the air was thick with the scent of corks, oak, and something far more sinister. Subscribe, like, and stay tuned. You're about to enter the labyrinth of deceit only Wolfe could untangle. Chapter 1: The Vintage Crime. The day had started like any other in the brownstone at 918 West 35th Street. Wolfe was ensconced in his armchair, belly rising and falling like a bellows, orchids scattered around him like a small jungle, and the faint tang of cigar smoke curling lazily through the air. Archie Goodwin, as usual, was pacing, boots scraping the hardwood floor, cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. "You're going to ruin another pair of socks if you keep pacing, Archie," Wolfe murmured without looking up from a manuscript on rare French wines. "I'm not pacing," Archie replied, tugging at his collar. "I'm preparing my legs for the field." Wolfe grunted. "If by field you mean a wine cellar, I suspect your preparation will be woefully inadequate. Now speak, Archie, and make it brief." The telephone rang, shrill and urgent. Archie snatched it up. "Archie Goodwin," he said. There was a pause. "Vincent Leclerc? Murder? Wait, slow down." By the time Archie hung up, Wolfe's expression had shifted subtly, a sign that something had piqued his intellectual curiosity. "Another wine tragedy, I presume?" Wolfe said, finally rising, a sluggish motion of philosophical inevitability. "Describe it." Archie exhaled, attempting brevity but failing. "It's at Leclerc Vineyards, on the outskirts of the city. Lucien Moreau, the wine critic, he's dead. Sprawled across the tasting room floor. No sign of struggle. Empty glass at his hand. And get this, there's a note, the true taste will reveal itself. Sounds like a puzzle, doesn't it?" Wolfe's gaze sharpened. "Indeed. A puzzle steeped in viticulture and venom. Pack a small satchel, Archie. We leave at once." By mid-afternoon, the brownstone had surrendered its occupants to the clattering of cab wheels on cobblestones. The estate was an elegant but fading relic, a sprawling vineyard with gnarled vines stretching like arthritic fingers toward a gray sky. The tasting room, where the tragedy had occurred, was a vaulted space of marble and oak, fragrant with the faint sweetness of aging wine and the pungency of polished wood. The body of Lucien Moreau had already been moved, but the echo of his demise lingered. Archie surveyed the scene, taking in details that the local police had apparently overlooked: the precise alignment of wine bottles on the racks, a subtle residue of sediment at the bottom of the glass, and the slight smudge of a fingerprint on the cork that did not match the deceased or anyone in immediate authority. Wolfe, meanwhile, walked slowly around the room, fingers steepled behind his back, nostrils flaring with an almost animalistic acuity. "Notice, Archie, the elegance of the setup. No sign of forced entry. No struggle. Someone wanted this to appear as a natural accident, or at least as an unfortunate mishap of the palate. The perpetrator knew Moreau, knew his habits, and knew the estate." Archie nodded, already cataloging suspects in his mind. There was Edgar Leclerc, the nephew, pale and fidgeting with a handkerchief; Cécile Moreau, the widow, whose hands betrayed a tremor she attempted to mask with her fan; Dominique Girard, the rival vintner, standing with the insolent air of a man unused to defeat; and Madame Bertin, the housekeeper, whose expression was unreadable, her fingers lingering on the edge of a sideboard as though seeking comfort from its polished wood. Wolfe, finally stopping in front of the tasting table, tapped the empty wine glass with a finger. "Sediment faint but present. The Merlot, 1927 vintage, filtered yet adulterated with subtle precision. The poison, I suspect, was something rare and undetectable without sophisticated analysis. Notice, too, the note. Linguistically, it mimics Moreau's own penchant for flourish, but it contains an imperfection, a clue meant to mislead and yet reveal itself to the perceptive eye. Archie frowned. So you think someone wanted to make it look like, what? A puzzle for you to solve? Precisely, Wolfe replied. This is less a crime of passion than an intellectual exercise, a duel of wits conducted over wine and death. Outside, the wind whispered through the vine-laden hills, a mournful accompaniment to the tableau inside. Archie glanced at the array of suspects, each concealing their own secrets beneath polite civility. One of them, he realized, had orchestrated this murder with the care of a composer arranging notes for a symphony. And Wolfe, as always, was the audience, conductor, and critic all in one. First things first, Archie, Wolfe said, turning toward him with a gleam of calculation in his eyes. Identify who could access the private cellar without arousing suspicion. Second, determine who possessed the chemical knowledge necessary for such a delayed effect. And third, he paused, savoring the weight of the statement. Discover who had the motive to deliver justice, or vengeance, in the most refined and devious manner conceivable. Archie exhaled, the thrill of the hunt coursing through him. This wasn't merely a murder. It was a chess game, and Wolfe had already moved several pieces before they had even entered the room. And somewhere among the polished oak and dusty bottles, the truth waited, as bitter and potent as the elixir that had claimed Lucien Moreau's life. Chapter 2: The Guests of the Vineyard. The early morning sun slanted across the vineyard like liquid gold, glinting off the dew on twisted vines and casting long shadows through the stone colonnades of Leclerc estate. Wolfe, impervious to the chill, stepped carefully along the gravel path, his eyes narrowing in quiet appraisal. Archie trailed, notebook at the ready, boots crunching over the uneven stones. The air smelled of oak, fermenting grapes, and a faint tang of something far less benign. Wolfe, Archie said, scanning the entrance. You ever get the feeling that these rich folk live in some alternate universe where crime is always a puzzle? Crime is always a puzzle, Archie, Wolfe replied, voice low and measured. But some puzzles are made to amuse the perpetrator more than to challenge the investigator. The estate, I note, is one such stage. They entered the grand tasting room once again, though now it was no longer a silent scene of death. The Leclerc household had gathered, each suspect drawn by curiosity, duty, or self-preservation. Their eyes flicked toward Wolfe as if expecting him to reveal the crime in a single glance. Archie introduced them for Wolfe's benefit. Edgar Leclerc, the nephew, thin and pallid, fingers twitching over his cuffs, a young man who seemed both burdened and relieved by the inheritance he might soon command. Cecile Moreau, the widow, clad in somber black, whose porcelain skin and delicate hands belied the fire in her eyes. She watched Wolfe with a mixture of fear and appraisal. Dominique Girard, the rival vintner, tall, imposing, and darkly handsome, with an air of arrogance that only a man accustomed to winning could carry. Madame Bertin, the housekeeper, small in stature but formidable in presence, whose keen gaze seemed to weigh Archie and Wolfe alike. Wolfe's assessment was swift and silent. Observe, Archie, each person presents a mask. Note their posture, gestures, and the inconsistencies in their responses. These will be more telling than words. Archie, scribbling furiously, asked the first question. Who last handled the 1927 Merlot before Lucien Moreau? Edgar's lips twitched nervously. I decanted it myself yesterday afternoon. Cecile Moreau interjected, voice soft but firm. Lucien insisted on the glass being poured by someone he trusted. He had a ritual. Only a person familiar with the wine's taste could ever hope to serve it properly. Dominique's smile was thin, almost venomous. And yet, accidents happened, yes? Perhaps the ritual failed. Madame Bertin, unruffled, added, or someone chose to manipulate the ritual. Her eyes flicked toward Edgar. Careful who you blame in this room, young man. Secrets do not remain buried for long. Wolfe, finally speaking, allowed a slight smile. Secrets, indeed, Madame Bertin. And in this room, several remain tightly corked, ready to spoil the unwary. I have no interest in assumptions. I require facts, observations, and the faintest trace of misdirection. That is all. He moved to the tasting table, studying the array of wine bottles. The sediment in Lucien's glass, though faint, clung to the curvature in a pattern impossible to overlook. "Archie," he murmured, "the poison's delayed action is key. Whoever administered it possessed not only access to the cellar but a knowledge of chemical properties sufficient to ensure it acted at the precise moment desired. A crude hand would have revealed itself sooner." Archie raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying it's an inside job?" Wolfe's expression was a study in calm certitude. "Precisely. And if one of these individuals did not wield both access and knowledge, they are either innocent or brilliant in their deception." The first interrogations began. Wolfe, seated in his familiar posture, allowed Archie to question each suspect under the guise of casual inquiry. He listened, dissecting inflections, inconsistencies, and subtle gestures. Edgar's nervous energy betrayed guilt, or the anticipation of exposure. Cecile's calm surface hid a mind racing through grief and suspicion. Dominique's arrogance revealed a man used to control, but not accustomed to being a pawn. Madame Bertin's careful neutrality masked sharp calculation and an intimate understanding of the estate's secrets. As the afternoon stretched, Wolfe requested access to the private cellar. Narrow corridors, barrel-strewn alcoves, and the musty perfume of aging wine surrounded them. Each bottle told a story, labels from decades past, some fading into oblivion, others remarkably preserved. Wolfe examined the bottles, hands gliding across corks and glass. "Archie," he said, "observe the subtle markings here, a tiny nick in the wood, an unusual dust pattern, faint traces of liquid on the staves. These are not mere accidents, they are evidence of movement, manipulation, and, in one case, deliberate tampering." Archie noted everything, mentally cataloging the suspect's potential interactions with the cellar. Wolfe added, with a flicker of amusement, "It is not merely access that matters. It is opportunity, motive, and the finesse to execute a plan while leaving no trace discernible to the untrained eye. The murderer has staged a tableau intended to confound investigators. We must determine whether they underestimated our acuity, or overestimated their own cleverness." As evening fell, the suspects departed, each under subtle scrutiny, leaving Wolfe and Archie in the dim light of the tasting room. The air was thick with the scent of grapes, wood, and secrets yet untold. Wolfe leaned against the marble table, eyes distant but piercing. "Archie, the Vineyard is a living archive," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Every bottle, every note, every interaction, recorded in subtle clues for those patient enough to observe. Our task is to read this archive and discover the bitter truth hidden beneath its delicate veneer." Archie exhaled, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "So, the game is officially on." Wolfe's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Indeed. And by sunrise, Archie, I intend to have all the moves of this particular game catalogued. The board is set. The pieces are in motion. Now we wait, observe, and prepare for the first real revelation." Outside, the vineyard swayed in the early evening breeze, a silent witness to a murder orchestrated with precision, intelligence, and malice, the perfect stage for a Nero Wolfe investigation. Chapter 3: The Hidden Manuscript. The morning arrived with a low-hanging fog that wrapped the vineyard in a muted, spectral veil. Wolfe, indifferent to the damp chill, moved through the estate like a slow-moving force of intellect, his eyes scanning the library and archives with practiced precision. Archie followed, notebook in hand, already smelling trouble in the musty pages and dust-laden corners of the old estate. The Leclerc archives were a historian's treasure trove, oak shelves lined with leather-bound records, yellowed tasting logs, and ancient ledgers chronicling decades of vintages, harvests, and experimental blends. Here, Wolfe claimed, lay the invisible footprints of the murderer. "Archie," Wolfe murmured, as he gently lifted a manuscript from a high shelf. "Observe the care with which these records were maintained. Every note, every annotation is deliberate. In a house of wine, precision is currency. And in this case, it may well be a confession hidden in plain sight." Archie leaned closer, scanning the cover, tasting notes of Lucien Moreau. His eyes widened. "Wait, this is Moreau's own notebook?" "Yes. And more importantly, Wolfe said, flipping the fragile pages with reverent precision. "It contains references to rare blends, chemical compositions, and even subtle hints at a recipe for what he called a perfect elixir. Observe." He pointed to a set of marginalia, cryptic symbols, smudged letters, and strange annotations in ink darker than the rest. Archie squinted. "This looks like it's been deliberately obscured." "Indeed. Someone wanted this portion unreadable, or at least misleading. Notice the repetition of certain symbols. That is not accidental, it is code. And only someone familiar with Lucien's habits would know what the symbols truly indicate." Wolfe's voice was calm but tinged with excitement. As Archie examined the text, he realized it was not merely tasting notes. Moreau had been experimenting with rare combinations of aged wine, extracts, and chemical compounds designed to alter flavor subtly. But some, Wolfe noted, could be lethal in the wrong hands. Archie whistled. "You're saying the critic left the recipe for his own death?" "Not left, Archie. Revealed, but in a way only an observant, capable mind could interpret," Wolfe corrected. "Our murderer may have used this manuscript as both a guide and a shield. By mimicking Moreau's own notation, they hoped to deflect suspicion while achieving their lethal end." Archie's pen scratched feverishly across the page. "So whoever did this knew Moreau inside and out. They had access to his notes, his tastings, and probably the cellar itself." Wolfe nodded, pacing between the stacks. "Access, knowledge, opportunity. These three are always the pillars of a well-constructed crime. But the artistry, Archie, lies in the execution. Observe the entries here, delayed effects, combinations designed to appear benign, careful timing. Whoever enacted the murder possessed both the technical expertise and the audacity to orchestrate it perfectly." Archie raised an eyebrow. "Technical expertise? You mean poison? Chemistry?" "Yes. A knowledge sufficient to employ compounds that act subtly, predictably, and lethally, yet leave minimal forensic trace." Wolfe's eyes scanned the shelves with intensity. "And notice the smudged entry here," he said, tapping the page. "The last tasting of the 1927 Merlot. Someone deliberately altered the manuscript to hide the final step, likely the addition of the bitter elixir itself." Archie frowned. "So, this isn't just a murder. It's a puzzle designed for you." "Of course. The murderer anticipated that only a mind capable of reading the manuscript correctly could deduce their identity. And that mind belongs to me." Wolfe's rare smile flickered. Wolfe then instructed Archie to retrace the movements of the estate staff over the past week. Madame Bertin had delivered wine to specific locations, Edgar had prepared the tasting room, and Dominique had visited under the guise of discussing future collaborations. Each movement could be a subtle part of a larger pattern. "And Archie," Wolfe added, "pay particular attention to any letters, correspondences, or unusual deliveries. The manuscript is the first layer. The next will reveal who applied the theory to practice." Archie nodded, feeling the familiar thrill of the intellectual chase. Somewhere in the stacks of old wine logs and parchment, the path to the killer was being traced, not by force, but by precision, knowledge, and subtle genius. As they left the archives, Wolfe paused at the doorway. "Remember, Archie, the vineyard itself is a record keeper. Barrels, bottles, stains, and smudges, they all tell stories. And the bitter elixir, once hidden, leaves a trail of both taste and intellect. Follow it carefully." Outside, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the twisted vines glistening in the morning light. In that moment, Archie understood that the case was no longer merely about murder. It was about decoding a symphony of intellect and deception, orchestrated by a killer who believed they could outthink the greatest detective in the city. And Wolfe, as always, would prove them spectacularly wrong. Chapter 4: The Gathering of Evidence. Back in the brownstone, the office was thick with the scent of orchids, cigars, and a faint trace of tension. Wolfe had retired to his favorite chair, arms folded across his ample torso, while Archie spread papers, notes, and the recently acquired manuscript across the desk. Outside, the city hummed with oblivious life, unaware that the threads of a deadly puzzle were being carefully woven into clarity within these walls. Wolfe's voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the clutter. "Archie, we have 3 elements of the crime established: access, knowledge, and opportunity. The manuscript confirms the method. What remains is motive, subtle behavior, and the ability to manipulate circumstance. Let us begin." Archie nodded, though he could not help smirking. "Sounds like you're assembling the perfect murder recipe, Wolfe. Only you read the ingredients backward and figure out who did it." Wolfe's eyes twitched with faint amusement. "Precisely. The first step was analysis of the suspect's actions." Archie recounted his interviews at Leclerc Estate. Edgar Leclerc, the nephew, had prepared the 1927 Merlot, yet his hands were steady only under observation. Behind closed doors he seemed restless, glancing toward the cellar whenever conversation drifted to it. Cecile Moreau, the widow, spoke gently, yet her eyes darted toward Edgar whenever the manuscript or tasting habits were mentioned. She maintained an exterior of calm, though Wolfe noted slight tremors in her voice when pressed on Lucien's final moments. Dominique Girard, the rival vintner, had visited under the pretext of negotiation, yet his alibi was thin and easily questioned. His arrogance seemed to conceal a simmering frustration at repeated failures to best Lucien professionally. Madame Bertin, the housekeeper, was a quiet observer. She knew the estate intimately, from the hidden compartments in the cellar to the peculiar habits of its owner. Her hands were clean, her eyes calculating. Wolfe began laying out the pieces of evidence on the office table. Tiny bits of sediment from the Merlot, photocopies of the manuscript with marginalia highlighted, photographs of fingerprints and corks, and notes from Archie's interviews. The detective's approach was methodical. Each item had a purpose, each observation a potential breakthrough. "The first priority," Wolfe said, tapping the sediment sample, "is to establish the method. The poison, as deduced, is not ordinary. It is subtle, slow-acting, and expertly mixed. Someone familiar with chemistry and wine would know precisely how to administer it without detection." Archie leaned over, inspecting the glass residue. "So that rules out anyone who isn't involved in the cellar or the actual preparation of the wine." "Correct," Wolfe said. "Access and skill, combined. Now observe the note left by the killer. Linguistically it mimics Moreau's style but contains subtle anomalies, a slight difference in pen pressure, a misused word, a symbol that Moreau himself used inconsistently." Archie frowned. "You're saying the killer tried to imitate Moreau's own writing? To throw suspicion off themselves?" "Precisely. And they partially succeeded, though only a mind accustomed to detailed observation could detect the inconsistency. That is where the intellectual duel begins." Wolfe then instructed Archie to revisit the estate's floor plans and chart every suspect's movement over the previous week. "Notice timing, proximity, and opportunity," he said. "Pay attention to seemingly inconsequential acts. Edgar carrying a wine bucket to a side entrance, Dominique lingering near the private cellar door, Madame Bertin removing certain barrels from observation. All are clues, Archie. None are irrelevant." Archie plotted the movements, noting patterns: Edgar's nervous glances, Bertin's precise handling of wine bottles, Dominique's insistence on observing Lucien's tasting rituals. The clues began to converge, forming a lattice of possibilities. Wolfe studied the map, his steepled fingers pressing against his lips. "Motive, Archie. Every action must be weighted against motive. Edgar's desire for control over the vineyard is clear. Dominique's revenge for ruined reputation is plausible. Cecile's motive is less obvious, yet the widow's grief may mask cunning intention. Bertin's motive lies in knowledge, the potential to protect or manipulate those around her." Archie looked skeptical. "So who actually did it?" Wolfe allowed a rare smile. "Not yet, Archie. But we are narrowing the field. Observe the smallest details: the way a bottle was uncorked, the precise moment a glass was served, the faint chemical signature of the poison. These are the whispers of a killer who believes themselves cleverer than they are." The breakthrough came when Wolfe examined the manuscript once more. Certain annotations, the smudges and alterations, matched handwriting known only to someone with intimate access, Edgar's handwriting, trained to mirror the style of others in the family. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible to an untrained observer, but Wolfe's eyes were sharper than any microscope. "Archie," Wolfe said finally, leaning back. "The murderer attempted to mislead investigators, but their knowledge of Moreau's habits betrayed them. The manuscript provided method, the estate provided opportunity, and now the motive is clear. Only one person had the combination of all three." Archie's grin widened. "You're talking about Edgar, aren't you?" Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Indeed. But we must not be hasty. The final proof, the confirmation of identity, requires a subtle trap, a method to draw out the murderer's own admission or error. Tomorrow, Archie, we shall set that trap." Outside, the night descended over the brownstone. Wolfe lit a cigar, smoke curling like a question mark in the dim lamplight. The pieces were almost in place. One more move, one more observation, and the bitter elixir of the old vineyard would reveal not just its composition, but its architect. Chapter 5. The Bitter Elixir Unveiled. The morning sun slanted into Wolfe's brownstone with a rare warmth, but the office was far from cheerful. Wolfe sat behind his desk, elbows on the polished wood, hands steepled, eyes narrowed in calculation. Archie lounged in the opposite chair, cigarette in hand, a notebook brimming with observations spread across his lap. The time had come to draw the threads together and expose the killer. Wolfe had sent for all involved parties under the pretense of a formal demonstration of wine tasting, and they arrived in sequence: Edgar Leclerc, Cécile Moreau, Dominique Girard, and Madame Bertin. Each suspected the other, glancing around nervously as Wolfe's imposing presence filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "we are gathered to discuss the circumstances surrounding the unfortunate demise of Lucien Moreau. The solution is not in conjecture, rumor, or grief. It is in observation, deduction, and the smallest details." Archie, watching silently, could almost hear the gears turning in Wolfe's mind. The detective's eyes flicked to each suspect, measuring reactions, noting micro-expressions, and cataloging subtle shifts in posture. "First," Wolfe continued, "we establish method. Lucien Moreau consumed a vintage 1927 Merlot, one decanted by Mr. Edgar Leclerc. The wine contained a substance with delayed toxic action, administered with precision to avoid immediate detection. Only someone with intimate knowledge of wine chemistry could have achieved this result." Edgar shifted uncomfortably. Cécile's eyes narrowed. Dominique scowled. Madame Bertin's expression remained unreadable. Wolfe allowed the moment to linger, letting tension saturate the air like the aroma of aged oak. Second, opportunity. Access to the private cellar, the manipulation of bottles, and familiarity with the estate's intricate layout were required. Only someone within the inner circle possessed this level of access. Wolfe paused, steepling his fingers and leaning forward slightly. And finally, motive. Mr. Leclerc, the nephew, has long resented both the critic's influence over the family vineyard and the burden of legacy imposed upon him. A combination of professional frustration, personal ambition, and poetic justice created the perfect storm. Edgar's hands clenched into fists. "You're saying, it was me?" "Precisely," Wolfe said, calm and unwavering. "However, the brilliance, or folly, of the act lay in the attempt to mimic Lucien Moreau's own handwriting in the note left at the scene. Linguistic analysis, pen pressure, and subtle deviations reveal the imitation. Only one person had both the motive and opportunity to commit the crime while orchestrating such an elaborate ruse." Edgar's face paled, and he glanced at Madame Bertin, hoping for an ally. But she only raised a faint eyebrow. "Do explain, Mr. Leclerc," she said dryly. "Why one should imitate the deceased rather than accept one's culpability." Wolfe allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Because, Madame Bertin, a true intellectual duel requires deception. And the murderer assumed they were cleverer than the observer. In this case, that observer is myself." Archie, leaning back, muttered under his breath, "Guess the lesson is, never let your uncle's vineyard give you ideas." Wolfe continued, tracing the crime on a diagram of the tasting room and cellar. "Observe here, the glass, the sediment, the timing of the decanting, the subtle smudge on the cork, all point unmistakably to Mr. Leclerc. He applied knowledge extracted from Lucien's own manuscript, designed to mask intent and delay effect. A remarkable plan, ruined by overconfidence and meticulous observation. Edgar finally slumped into a chair, muttering, "It was perfect. I thought I could get away with it." "Perfect, perhaps, in concept," Wolfe replied, voice cool as marble. "Execution, however, is another matter entirely. One cannot outread a mind trained to notice every smudge, every stroke, every nuance of human behavior. One cannot deceive Nero Wolfe." Cecile Moreau exhaled sharply, relieved, while Dominique's scowl deepened into quiet fury. Madame Bertin merely nodded, as if confirming the accuracy of Wolfe's deductions. Wolfe concluded with his signature flourish. "Wine may age gracefully, but vengeance leaves a bitter taste, even when served in a crystal glass. Mr. Leclerc, you have experienced the bitterness firsthand." Archie could not resist adding a flourish of his own. "Looks like Edgar finally uncorked more than just a Merlot." Edgar was taken into custody, the case resolved with the precision of a master chess player's final move. Wolfe returned to his office, reclining in his chair, hands clasped behind his head. Archie sat nearby, scribbling final notes for his column. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the delicate intellectual duel that had unfolded within a quiet brownstone. Wolfe's orchids thrived, the scent of victory, or at least justice, lingering in the air. The bitter elixir had revealed its architect, and the world, as usual, could continue unaware. Archie finally spoke, voice tinged with admiration. "You really do make it look easy, Wolfe." Wolfe's eyes flicked toward him. "That, Archie, is the essence of true observation, to make the complex appear simple, while hiding the immense effort beneath." And with that, the brownstone returned to its quiet, orderly rhythm, leaving behind only the faint memory of a vineyard, a poisoned vintage, and the intellectual duel that had brought a killer to justice.